Hello, hello. Welcome to Wicked Words, the podcast where you get to listen to my terrible New England accent while I talk about true crime and other dark topics. Today we have a case that confused me at first. I had to reread the headlines multiple times because they just seemed so fake, and I thought I was on like one of those joke websites, but no. I did my rabbit hole research, and this is real. This is kind of a crazy one. So without further ado, let's get started. Reporters rushed to ready their articles for the next day's newspaper. They had never heard of a story like the one which had unfolded during the early morning hours of October 12th, 1950. Around 6:30 a.m., the Long Beach Fire Department received a phone call from a frantic woman screaming about an emergency in Unit 313 at the Humphreys building, and an ambulance was immediately dispatched to the 132 Pine Avenue address. Upon their arrival, EMTs found a scrawny little girl lying on the couch. It was easily recognized that she was deceased as first responders placed her onto a stretcher and loaded her into the emergency vehicle. But it wasn't until she was admitted to Seaside Hospital that an official declaration of death was made. Katherine Erickson's passing didn't initially appear notable, but by the conclusion of her autopsy, the medical examiner knew her name would be in the headlines nationwide. Katherine K. Frances Erickson was born on April 22, 1940, in San Pedro, California, the only child of Beatrice Louise Grover and Harry A. Erickson. The couple had married in Yuma, Arizona, just 5 years before Kay's birth. Beatrice described her daughter as a normal child, and although she could be a bit high-strung and was very stubborn, she thoroughly enjoyed expressing herself through art, music, and dance. In an effort to support her child's interests, Beatrice enrolled Kay in piano, dance, and gymnastics classes at only 5 years old. In 1947, the family moved to Long Beach, and in that same year, Kay started taking accordion lessons. By the time Kay reached the 4th grade, she was struggling to balance her schoolwork and extracurricular activities. She was said to have a below-average IQ, which made education even more daunting to the little girl. So in May of 1950, Beatrice withdrew Kay Frances from school, citing a nervous stomach condition. This early release granted Katherine the time she desperately craved in order to practice the accordion, something she had fallen in love with and longed to master. Her teacher, Violet John Burling, told her that she could be a virtuoso as a result of the raw talent she possessed. All Kay required was intense training, and lucky for her, Violet was willing to provide just that. Beatrice was reluctant at first, given the fact the family hadn't been able to make a payment on Kay's lessons in over a year. But Burling insisted that the Ericksons were not the only needy family. Violet taught many pupils pro bono. She even cared for some of them overnight. With Harry away for extended periods at the Navy shipyard in San Diego, Beatrice considered the offer with hesitancy. But the more Kay pleaded and begged with her mother to let her go, the more Beatrice's reluctance eroded. Beatrice was going back to school to become a nurse now that her husband was working, and the deal seemed tempting given the circumstance. So in the summer of 1950, she agreed, dropping her daughter off at the studio on the afternoon of July 17th. Little did Beatrice realize, her daughter would be discovered lifeless in that same studio only weeks later. After being pronounced deceased at Seaside Hospital, Kay Erickson's body was transported to the Los Angeles County morgue, where an autopsy was performed by Dr. Victor Cephalou. Ultimately, Kay's cause of death was determined to be aspiration of regurgitated food, and Violet Burling was placed under arrest when the manner of death was ruled as homicide. A quick introduction to clarify that cause of death is the condition, injury, or circumstance that leads to the death. The manner of death is the way in which the death occurred, usually homicide, suicide, accidental, natural, or undetermined. Back to the story. The autopsy surgeon, as they were called, reported that Katherine Francis was covered in cuts, bruises, and burns in varying states of healing. The 10-year-old was at least 15 pounds underweight, measuring at only 54 pounds. She had indentations around her wrists and ankles, suggesting that she had been bound tightly, and a gag had presumably been used, proving fatal when Katherine began to vomit, most likely from shock. That wasn't the worst to be revealed through his examination, though. There were triangular abrasions found all over the girl's pubic area, and she had multiple vaginal tears. Her vagina and anus were both dilated, the result of repeated instances of forcible penetration, Dr. Cephalou believed. Signs of lividity showed that Kay had been sitting up at the time of her death, which the medical examiner estimated had occurred at least 5 hours prior to the call for help. During the police search, blood-stained accordion straps were discovered, causing the pathologist to assume the girl had been tied to a chair with them. At once, the wild story of a sexually deviant accordionist who had tortured her young student to death was printed across the front page all over Los Angeles County, soon spreading to St. Louis and New York before skipping the pond over to London. Violet John Burling was suddenly infamous. On January 3, 1951, her trial began, drawing in news outlets from across the world to the LA courthouse, where they would remain camped for the subsequent 17 weeks. The Burling trial set records as one of the longest criminal trials in the county's history. The juiciest details would be described in black and white print almost daily, accompanied by grainy photos of the curly-haired crook. Beatrice told the jury about the isolation that set in soon after she dropped her daughter off at the studio. Violet would urge Beatrice and Harry not to visit or call, as the distractions would trigger Kay to, quote, lose her touch, unquote, and play poorly. When this happened, Kay would become hysterical, and that was the last thing Beatrice wanted for her already stressed daughter. The Ericksons weren't even allowed to watch their child perform at recitals, alleging Miss Berling had advised them that the events were, quote, private affairs, unquote. The prosecution called up students of Miss Burling, both present and former, who would attest to the abuse they witnessed Kay Francis endure at the hands of their instructor. One girl, Thelma Watts, didn't study under Burling, but Miguel Verdugo, the owner of the studio with whom Burling was romantically involved. Watts remembered Kay having 2 black eyes that were so swollen the girl could barely open them. She also stated that Kay's fingers were always bruised and bandaged, something Violet said was a result of Kay's constant chewing on them. Mary Fury was a 14-year-old who witnessed Violet smack Kay Francis across the face before screaming at the girl that she wasn't afraid to beat her because of Mary Jo's presence. It was 9-year-old Laura Carpenter who was the prosecution's star witness, however. She relayed to the court in great detail about instances in which she saw Violet hit Kay on the hands with a ruler and kick the girl, encouraging the other pupils to join in on the abuse. Laura recalled several times when Kay's face was wrapped almost entirely in elastic bandages, with only her eyes and nose visible. She testified to seeing Kay tied up, lying on the floor, and sometimes strapped to a chair. Laura claimed that Kay wasn't the only child mistreated by Burling, though. Another student, known only as Joanne, had been smacked in the face by the teacher. Kay, Joanne, Laura, and a boy named Jimmy were all part of Burling's children's quartet, and the group would often practice at the studio into the late hours of the night. it wasn't uncommon for them to sleep on the sofa instead of going home. These children were sometimes treated to trips to the amusement park or the movie theater, but when Kay would accompany them, the kids claimed that she was forced to tie scarves around her eyes. When Berling and Verdugo would go out to dinner, they would bind Kay to a filing cabinet in the studio, making her stand for hours until they returned. On the off chance Katherine was permitted to come with them, she was only allowed to eat a cracker and some soup. This still wasn't the worst of the testimony from the accordion student. Laura sobbed about the fear struck into her by Violet after a particularly unnerving event. One day, Violet forced Kay Francis to stand in front of the quartet, pull her pants down, and masturbate in front of the children, only stopping when told. She claimed Violet hollered at the trio to watch, ending the horror only when the group could bear to look no longer. Bruises and cuts could be seen covering Kay's legs, and Violet warned them dreadful things would happen if they told anybody about what occurred that day. When Violet Burling finally took the stand, it was difficult to look at her without seeing pure evil. Still, the jury attempted to remain unbiased, giving her side a fair listen. But the story Violet had to tell was quite unbelievable. Violet explained that Katherine Francis would be left at her studio until 10:30 p.m. some nights, and eventually Beatrice revealed to her that she and Harry were separating, begging the music teacher to take in her daughter for a short time while the couple sorted out their situation. Burling was uncertain at first, but after Beatrice confided that she couldn't leave Kay alone with Harry due to sexual abuse that had occurred, Violet felt like she had no choice but to agree. Before long, she realized that Katherine was seriously mentally ill. Violet noticed Kay would claim to hear voices, holding rolled-up newspapers to her ear to imitate spirit trumpets that she had seen at healing services her mother had brought her to. Beatrice attended churches that practiced cosmic ray healing and used divination rods. The mother and daughter even believed God had sent them a message insisting Kay Francis would be a great accordionist in the future. Violet felt these practices negatively affected the impressionable child, who imagined that she could communicate with the spirit of her dead grandfather, as well as another deceased man who possibly molested Katherine. Violet was adamant that she did not prevent the Ericksons from visiting their daughter. Instead, Burling insisted that Beatrice refused to come unless, quote, the spiritual current was right, unquote. This physical absence translated into emotional distance between the family. Violet alleged that there was a total lack of affection, no hugs or endearing words among any of them. Feelings of loneliness and abandonment manifested through Kay's anger. The girl would tell her teacher that she hated her family, and she wished that they were dead so she never had to return home. Violet even said that Kay revealed that she had thought about turning on the gas at night while her parents were asleep. The little girl was prone to tantrums and would act possessed, Violet stated. She would fall into trances where she'd stare blankly. Sometimes, Kay would close her eyes half-masted and play the accordion, later claiming it was at the insistence of the voices. Yet, these weren't the most disturbing details, Burling counterclaimed. Violet said Kay Francis masturbated excessively and enjoyed hurting herself. She recollected a day in which the girl was left alone for about 20 minutes, and upon Violet's return, she discovered that Kay had scorched her skin with a flat iron. When Violet asked her why she would do such a thing, the child simply replied, quote, because it feels good, end quote. Violet stated that Kay believed she had healing powers and would hurt herself purposely to prove to non-believers, rubbing her hands over her open wounds. A week before Katherine's death, Violet called the Ericksons to alert them to the unusual behavior. The most recent episodes including bouts of sleepwalking, where Kay would mumble incoherently about death. Violet asserted that Beatrice insisted a family friend must be performing black magic on the girl, and suggested a whipping to snap her out of it. Instead, Violet opted to tie her to a straight-back chair as a preventative to the self-mutilation. On that terrible October day, Violet had fallen asleep while writing music and was woken to the feeble cries of Katherine from the other room. When Violet followed the sound, she found Kay strapped to a chair. Weakly, Kay begged for Violet to take the accordion off of her lap, but there was no instrument in sight. This was not the condition in which Violet had left the girl the night before, so she assumed Kay had done that to herself somehow. The defense blamed Miguel Verdugo for a majority of the abuse that couldn't be self-inflicted. Violet recalled the time that Kay had commented about wanting to kill her parents. When Miguel heard the little girl say this, he flew into a rage, ripping off his belt and lashing Kay Francis. When Violet attempted to stop him, Miguel turned his rage towards her. Burling said the only reason Kay Francis was not allowed to go to dinner with them was because Verdugo didn't want others to see the girl's bruises. She cared very deeply for all of her students, bestowing upon them little gifts when she could, such as toys and clothes, sometimes even gold jewelry that her father had made. The district attorney took this example of kindness and dramatized it, accusing Violet of being a homosexual pedophile, grooming her students for her sadistic satisfaction. To corroborate their theory, they included photos of Violet with her hair in a top bun, a hairstyle thought to be masculine for the era. They even accused her mother of raising Violet as a boy, causing confusion about the woman's gender identity later in life. The defense retorted that there were over 100 love letters between Violet and Verdugo that had been confiscated by the police, evidence enough that their suggestion was flawed. Besides, Burling's closet was filled with dresses, not a single pair of slacks in her possession. Although she was considered a spinster, Violet had been involved with 54-year-old Miguel since his divorce in 1946. Coincidentally, Verdugo had been granted immunity after his arrest in exchange for his testimony against Burling. Even after she declined his jailhouse proposal, his statements only strengthened her version of events. Over 20 recesses were required throughout the trial. Violet fainted a dozen times, twice while on the stand, and her frail condition forced her to be carried from the courthouse more than once. Many notes were made in the record pertaining to Burling's physical condition, as she appeared to have severe tremors on one day and looked listless and apathetic, although conscious, on another. There were periods where Violet would rest her head on the table, complaining of a headache and dizziness. Toward the end of the trial, she even showed up sporting an eye patch, the consequence of an eye infection. For their closing statement, the prosecution presented a blackboard with the drawing of a tombstone. The words, K. Francis Erickson, 1940 to 1950, murdered by a friend, written across the imaginary monument. This tactic was much more impressive than the defense's desperate reiteration of Violet's innocence, arguing that sweat on the stretcher in an ambulance proved that Kay was still alive when she arrived at the hospital, and it was the ventilator she was subsequently placed on that caused her untimely death. Violet protested with the first responders that there was still a pulse as they wheeled Kay Francis from the studio. Of this, she was positive. The jury of 7 men and 5 women deliberated for 8 days. There had been no doubt of guilt, they said. It was simply a matter of deciding to which degree Burling was guilty of. And at last, they elected that first-degree murder with a life sentence was a suitable punishment for her crime. When the verdict was read out loud, Violet cried, quote, "No, I am innocent," end quote, before fainting once again. Her mother stood up and shouted, quote, "This is not justice. My daughter is innocent," end quote, before she was forcibly removed from the courthouse. The bright flashes from the reporters' cameras burned Violet's eyes as she was hauled away to the California Institute for Women in Corona. And in an instant, she was forgotten. Yesterday's news. Until 2 years later, when a routine appeal was filed on behalf of Violet Berling. The curious logic behind her appeal grabbed the press's attention, refreshing the media's memory of the murderous accordionist. Because Burling had fainted so many times during her trial, she was, quote, mentally absent, end quote, and not able to actively participate in her defense, a violation of her constitutional right. It was also argued that Violet had been denied a lawyer during questioning and was threatened into confessing by the police. The sentence was reversed and the retrial was granted. Violet waived her right to a jury trial, hoping that she'd stand a better chance with just one person deciding her innocence or guilt. The retrial was rescheduled when the day before, Judge George Francis suffered a heart attack while on the bench. He was hospitalized and recovered, but another delay forced the date back once again, when Violet's attorney, Albert Ramsey, was struck with laryngitis. Due to his illness, he was unable to review the case with his client, as he could not speak and she could not read, resulting in communication breakdown. After a one-day trial in May of 1953, Violet Berling was sentenced to second-degree murder and ordered to serve 5 to life with the possibility of parole after 50 years. By this time, Violet was blind from corneal ulcers, which had worsened during her trial. She learned Braille throughout her prison stay and spent her days gardening. Sometimes Violet would play the accordion for her mother during the occasional visit. After serving 15 years, she was paroled at the age of 46, with the stipulation that she is not allowed around small children. In 1974, she was released from the custody of California completely, a free woman finally. Violet lived out her life under an alias in Anaheim, California, until she passed away on February 27, 1983, only 1 month before her 65th birthday. Born in White Bear, Minnesota, on March 18, 1918, Violet Berling was the middle daughter of Thekla Schauer and William Axel Burling. Thekla, a German Jewish immigrant, had been a vaudeville performer, while William, a Minnesota native, was a jewelry maker and a painter. Violet attended Central High School in St. Paul, where she proudly represented her heritage as a member of the German Club. By 1940, Violet was 22 years old and had moved from her parents' home in St. Paul, Minnesota, to Long Beach, California, taking on the stage name Violet Johns. Violet didn't achieve the fame she had hoped for, finding herself employed with the Ringling Brothers in 1945 as a secretary rather than a performer. Burling met Miguel Mike Verdugo, and the two began a relationship, despite Mike's almost 15-year marriage. It wasn't long before Violet began working as a secretary in Verdugo's studio. Despite having her own apartment on Orange Street, Violet preferred to sleep at the studio because the access to a phone and a lack of transportation home. The box-shaped Humphrey building was reminiscent of an accordion, only adding to her fondness for it. Today, the Department of Health and Human Services is headquartered at the building, providing mental health, childcare, and a plethora of other services to the citizens of LA County. Transitioning into our post-story rant, let's discuss some facts and maybe I'll find a point somewhere along the way. Violet's mother, Thekla Schauer, was born in Austria and was part of the Sonnenthaler troupe of Tyrolean serenaders, which they traveled throughout Europe. Thekla immigrated to the United States at 21 years old, leaving out of Sheffield, England, and arriving at Ellis Island, New York, on one of the last journeys of the SS Blucher, which was a ship that was seized by the Brazilian government not long after this journey. The Sonnenthaler troupe moved across America, making papers from Portland to Salt Lake City and, of course, the Big Apple. Schauer became a naturalized citizen and settled down with William. They married in Douglas, Wisconsin, but they ended up making their home in White Bear. They had their first child, Margaret, and moved to St. Paul, but then they ended up moving back to White Bear, where they gave birth to Violet. William Burling was the son of Swedish immigrants who married mere months before his birth. There wasn't a lot that I could see about his early life, with the exception that he was an inmate at only 8 years old. I couldn't find whether this was like a reform school or an orphanage, but there wasn't much public information about his parents, so I'm not sure if they died while he was a little boy or if they returned to Sweden. I have no idea. I did find records that he became a jewelry apprentice at only like 13 and ended up becoming a watchmaker and eventually opened his own business, his own painting company. At the time of Violet's arrest, her parents were separated, with William living in St. Paul and Thekla in California. I left a spot here that says insert rabbit hole notes about sisters, but I didn't end up going down that rabbit hole, to be honest. I know that she has two sisters, one named Margaret May and another named June, but I cut myself off from going down that rabbit hole. Sorry, guys. I was able to find some information about Katherine Francis's parents, though. Despite separating, they never divorced. And in 1961, Harry Erickson passed away, which gave Beatrice the liberty to marry. She ended up remarrying in 1979 to a man named Paul Compton Scheckler in Reno, Nevada, only a month after his divorce from his wife was finalized. I feel like Harry got really like a bad rap. He was kind of painted as a deadbeat during the trial. It was said that he barely ever worked, and he even was accused of sexually abusing Kay. But from what I could tell, he was regularly employed. They have him listed in the census as a, quote, trouble man, which I found out is actually an electrician. He was also a, quote, marine electrician with the government, so I'm guessing that was part of his job working on the Navy ships. Some of the most fascinating testimony came from the children that Violet had taught. But the funny thing is, on cross-examination, the star witness, Laura Carpenter, actually reversed her testimony and admitted that her mother had kind of coerced her into doing and saying these things. Turns out Laura's mom really hated Violet and had already made up her mind that Violet was guilty. She even was quoted as saying that she had hoped Violet would die in the gas chamber, which is something that Laura reiterated on the stand. After Laura reversed her testimony, the prosecution actually decided against putting the other two children on the stand, which I believe were Joanne and Jimmy, and they probably felt like their whole case was being torn apart because it was being held together by 8 9-year-olds. Part of the defense's argument was that Kay had inflicted most of the wounds to herself, even accusing the girl of hitting her head against the wall. Beatrice actually admitted that Kay would hit her legs against furniture at home for sympathy. And she also said that Kay's doctor had suggested music lessons as a way to quell the girl's, quote, emotional instability, unquote. So it seems like there was knowledge of some sort of emotional disturbance with the girl. Violet claimed that part of accordion training is tying your arm to the chair to ensure proper posture while you're playing. I couldn't find anything about this being like a tip of the trade, but I did find a story from virtuoso Eddie Montero, who remembered his mother had tied him to the chair to learn accordion when he was only 5 years old. When Violet was taken to the jail, there were 3 large scratch marks from her shoulder towards her chest, and she claimed that they were from her accordion straps. She was also covered in bruises. It's honestly very difficult to verify the true facts of this case and determine whether Violet was really the monster she was portrayed as. Well, it's suspicious that she called Miguel before calling the police. Some students confirm that Kay did believe she had healing powers. I think the most damning part was Beatrice's own admission that her daughter was prone to hurting herself for attention and seemed to have these mental issues. On one occasion, Violet took Kay to the doctor for her injured fingers, and the physician actually testified that Kay refused to keep them bandaged. And when he asked her why, she told him to shut up and ignored him for the rest of the visit. It was also concluded that the state had established 3 separate times of death, but decided to use the earliest one. In hindsight, it seems that there was reasonable doubt, but perhaps the sensationalized media that surrounded the case kind of tainted the ability for Violet to get a fair trial. The start of yellow journalism, or fake news, actually began in the 1800s with the competition between newspapers. Owners William Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer exaggerated the headlines and were said to have sparked the United States' entry into the Spanish-American War, even encouraging the assassination of President William McKinley. With the uprise in crime, the press took advantage of these tragedies and used it to sell copies. The more bizarre and outlandish the details, the more issues sold. Cases like the extortion of silent film starlet Clara Bow and the murder of Elizabeth Short, more commonly known as the Black Dahlia, and the assassination of mobster Benjamin Bugsy Siegel were all front-page stories, sure to sell like hotcakes, but they tended to lack factual information and would crudely post graphic photos. Advertisers seized this development, tripling their investment in the paper advertising rather than the radio or even emerging television that was coming out, especially in the newspapers that seemed to focus more on this jazz journalism, or junk journalism as it was facetiously referred to. A pattern started to form with the sensationalized news and followed by the increase in ad revenue, rinse and repeat. But what happens when there's nothing worth reporting on? Creative liberties take over. Is that what happened in the case of Kay Erickson? I'm not sure, but what I do know is that Violet Berling's parents both passed away prior to her release on parole, and she had never married or had children. She was utterly alone in the world, a world that remembered her as a monster. The only thing she had to keep her company was her accordion. The accordion was invented in Germany and is the official instrument of San Francisco, which isn't surprising because it was said that San Francisco kind of overshadowed Los Angeles. While the squeeze box was popular among German immigrants, it launched its more mainstream popularity with the fame of Lawrence Welk. Welk created a wave of renewed interest in the accordion on the West Coast when he came over in the 1940s and encouraged Long Beach children to kind of beg their parents for lessons. Welk signed autographs and met with the local children, and this kind of gave German immigrants the ability to share their heritage with their community. And it lightened that tension that kind of lingered around German descendants from after the World Wars. There has always been a rivalry between the East and West Coast, and it's no different when it comes to news reporting. Cities in the East Coast were more focused on finance, which allowed the West Coast to incorporate art and music into their culture. So perhaps it's only organic that sensationalism started primarily in the San Francisco newspapers. William Hearst introduced what he called, quote, mortality plays sprinkled with adultery and nudity, end quote. And he dedicated a quarter of his Daily Examiner to reporting exclusively on these somewhat sustainable stories. While they were entertaining for the reader, they were severely misleading to the public in general, sometimes purposely. Journalists have this duty to research their stories and present them in an ethical way. Had this practice been followed, it's possible that Violet could have been found not guilty. Some of the more dramatic parts of the murder case were attributed to sexual abuse, but the only evidence of this was the dilation, which can occur naturally after death. If Kay had been masturbating, as a curious kid might do, it could explain the vaginal tears, but it seemed like the legal system at that time was kind of a joke anyway. The prosecution presenting the photos of Violet with her hair in a bun as proof that she's a lesbian, and the defense had actually introduced Violet's pet turtles and her plants into evidence as like a counterclaim that she was, actually this caring woman. It's just, how do you take that trial seriously, regardless of the headlines? My speculation is that Miguel Verdugo had something more to do with it. The initial phone call that Burling made to him, the abuse that she claimed to have endured by him, and the fact that he was also arrested kind of pushed me in that direction. Both he and Violet refused to take lie detector tests, which honestly means nothing because they're useless tests. But he was offered immunity in exchange for testifying against Violet, yet he never even testified in the first trial. I feel the reason he wasn't called to stand was because he would be open to cross-examination at that point, and it could have potentially destroyed the prosecution's case. The prosecution called Violet's mother, however, and she was only able to testify for a few questions because she became so hysterical. Verdugo was the only witness at Violet's retrial where she was charged with the lesser degree of murder. Her mother was actually placed in Camarillo State Hospital right before the retrial because she was so messed up from the nerves of testifying again that she was deemed mentally ill by the LA court, and she had been denied actual access to the railroad to get to her daughter's trial. They said that she was so distraught and supposedly was having visual hallucinations, but she ended up causing Violet to become severely nervous and worried for her. So Violet barely ate before her retrial and became sick. It was just this vicious loop. While researching, I found this story about a blind accordionist named Norbert Slamma. Apparently, he asked the Hollywood starlet Ava Gabor out for dinner one night, and she agreed, but she ended up standing him up. He was arrested and questioned because, as turns out, Ava and her husband were actually tied up and robbed the same night. Okay, to wrap this up, let me tell you about the Dark Vault. It's a collection of items that are said to be like haunted or possessed, and the owner claims to have an accordion that belonged or possibly belonged to Violet Berling, and supposedly it plays by itself. What song do you think it plays? Leave your guess in the comments below. I think that it's probably Our Lady of Spain, which is apparently like a running joke among accordionists. So I think that would be pretty fitting. I'm not even going to attempt to guess which episode I'm going to release next week. Honestly, it seems like I make a promise to you guys and then end up finding a completely different case halfway through. So I apologize for that, and I hope you're all enjoying my content regardless. I really do appreciate all the support, and I have been struggling, honestly, in the past, it's been a couple of years, but I've really been struggling the past couple of weeks with my sleep and have a doctor's appointment actually tomorrow. So hopefully I get some help with that and get some relief. So if the quality of this podcast is slacking a bit, I apologize. I really do. I am making the effort to improve. And if you have any feedback, as always, feel free to leave it below, or any case suggestions, feedback, anything you want to send to me, you can always send to my email at wickedwordsyt@gmail.com. I always like to make little suggestions at the end of my podcast for the listeners, and today I want to try and encourage you guys to take a lesson in a musical instrument that maybe you've been interested in for a while. For me, after reading about all the blind accordionists, I'm kind of inspired to try the squeeze box myself, so we'll see how that goes. Maybe I can find a pretty cheap one and find a local accordionist that can give me some lessons. If not, I can buy a cheap one and try and find someone online that provides lessons virtually. We'll see how that goes, though. Maybe I'll upload a video. Anyway, it's time to say goodbye. I wish you all stay safe, and as always, I'll catch you on the flip side.